this moment that we're in, we think of it as really spurring us into focus. It's also really humbling. And so our approach in this humbling moment is to lead with questions as opposed to trying to give a set of answers. And seeing things in a new light. So in that regard, one way that I think about leadership lenses in light of the pandemic and the weeks of lockdown, I don't know if, since we have people all over the world, we are going to have a lot of different varieties of trees and birds. But in my neighborhood, it has been remarkable how loud the birds are singing these days. Do you notice that? And so we're asking ourselves, is it that the air is so cleaned up that there's much less pollution that we're causing by traveling and moving around? Are the birds rejoicing because of that? Or have I just been inside so long that now I'm noticing it? And maybe it's both. So it's a little bit like that, like noticing the nature that is around us. The lenses that we're going to present have actually been there all along. And at the same time, we've been in crisis mode. So being in crisis mode helps us shift from seeing and focusing on the things that keep us busy to the things that really matter.
But again, we also want to make sure that as we begin to think about reopening, depending on, again, where you are in the world, but as we begin to think about what's next, this next iteration of school, whatever that looks like, that it's not just about how do we social distance in the classroom, or how do we make sure that you know, we create cultures that are more comfortable with ongoing risk, because that's going to be the reality in the world. But what is this moment telling us about the future? What is the moment suggesting to us in terms of how we think not only about opening day, but also how we move forward into, again, a different place, a different way of thinking about the experience that kids have. And so that's, again, what these lenses are going to try to do, not just give you some sense of what's happening in the moment, but also projecting out into the future and using them as a filter, as a frame for the decisions that you make, not only on a day-to-day basis right now, but as you think about moving forward.
First one we thought is foundational, and it is world. Thinking about what is happening in the world and how this impacts, it has to impact everything that we are doing. And the big shift we're finding that we think has happened is that we are all in this together. We are truly all in this together. We cannot afford to think of ourselves in silos, and everything about our learning, our cultures, needs to reflect that.
You know, it's not really about us giving people power. It's about creating conditions where their own power can come to the surface, where they are allowed to use the power that they inherently have to do the things that they have a purpose for. So it really is about agency. And agency is not just saying to kids, okay, you have a choice, here's the outcome, I'm going to determine that, but you have a choice now. There's 3 different ways that you can get to my outcome. That's not really agency. That's just kind of playing a game with them, saying I'm going to give you, you know, more freedom or whatever, but really not letting them decide what their own outcomes are, what their own purposes are. So I think one of the most powerful quotes I've read in the last few years comes from Sean Michael Morris. And when he talks about agency, he says, it does not give us power over each other or another, but it gives us mastery over ourselves. And an education that does not encourage or facilitate this agency is not an education.
And so change is in the during, and it's difficult. And it leads us to ask some big questions. You will have more, but how do we start to begin a culture that accepts and embraces change and uncertainty, that really keeps us in the during, in the cocoon, and responding to difficult places, iteration, imagination, failure, divergent thinking, diversity at a profound level. We recognize that, you know, a little bit like the beautiful essay, I talk about it all the time, Arundhati Roy, published in the Financial Times. She's one of my favorite writers from India, where she describes the pandemic as the portal. And so just a quick summary, it's basically this threshold where we get to choose. Are we going to drag what she calls the carcasses of prejudice and hatred, our data banks, our dead ideas? Are we going to take that carcass of those dead ideas through the threshold post-pandemic? Or we get to sit in the moment of change in that during story and reflect, reevaluate what is most important to us. And, you know, when we consider what is sacred, everything else is on the table.